Welcome, everybody. My name is Philip Jennings, and I'm going to be moderating this session at the Sporting Chance Forum, dedicated to the theme of mega sporting events and workers' rights. I'd like to welcome you all to this crucial session, and I'd like to congratulate the organizers for choosing today, because today is October the 7th, which is the World Day for Decent Work. And social media should be ringing with the noise from the labor movement worldwide about the call that they have for decent work, for jobs, for decent wages, for equality and economic justice. And therefore, the timing is helpful to us in this theme. The theme today is about decent work and workers' rights in the sporting contest. And the sporting context. It is about those major prestigious events and the extent to which these events are put together consistent with international human rights standards. The call for the World Day of Decent Work is essentially for a new social contract. And I have to say, as moderator, that I would like to see a new social contract throughout sport, and I see that as a responsibility of the center itself. And just to fast forward to show what is ahead of us, for the Summer Games in Paris in 2024, the organizers are claiming that this is the first Summer Olympic Games with a social contract. A social contract has been negotiated with the major trade union federations in France, with the employers' federations and the organizing committee, and they're already working together to put this social contract in place as an integral part of not just the organization of the games, the execution of the games, and the legacy of the games. They're looking at jobs, they're looking at vulnerable workers, they're looking at freedom of association and collective bargaining issues, not just in France, but also down the supply chain. And I think what's happening there is indicative of the times ahead of us, that the demands and the bars are being set for a new social contract, not just in sport in general, but in particular with mega sporting events. For the center really owes its existence to the concerns over the organization of mega sporting events in the past. It started as a platform for organizers, for hosts, for governments, NGOs, and sports federations to consider the issues that emerge in the organization of mega sporting events. Now, we know about the prestige that they can bring. We know about the costs that come with it. We know about the issues that can emerge, controversial human rights issues which emerge during the course of the games. And then you get the unexpected with the pandemic and the health and safety concerns that this emerged, which cast a large cloud over the Tokyo Olympics. So for us at the center, this is key to the new strategy that we have here, Convergence 2025, to have mega sporting events which are consistent with human rights standards. I'm a former labor leader. I was a general secretary of Uni Global Union. I've seen first sight the issues that emerge in terms of the risks to workers' rights during mega sporting events, from freedom of association, collective bargaining, non-payment of salaries, treatment of migrant workers, non-payment of overtime, and a general shoddiness when it came to treating the people with dignity and care. Now, the first Olympics took place in 776 BC, and apparently Zeus was so pleased with the fact that the Olympics were taking place that he sent a bolt of lightning to Mount Olympia, where the games were going to take place, and all of a sudden the infrastructure was built. Unfortunately, we can't rely on thunderbolts these days, but if you get it wrong, those thunderbolts will arrive in various forms. Today, we have three distinguished speakers to help us address this issue. Three lightning bolts in their own regard. We have the International Labour Office. The International Labour Office is important. The first social contract, I think, in the modern era was agreed in the foundation of the International Labour Office in 1919. The Qatar World Cup was a controversial choice, and numbers of issues have raised about the treatment of workers and migrant workers in particular. We have a very interesting story to tell us about how the authorities and how the community has dealt with these worker rights issues. And I've given a very warm welcome to Max Tuñón, who is the head of the ILO Project Office for the state of Qatar. He's on the front line of this issue, and we're going to get a frontline report on the issues that he has been dealing with and the progress that has been made. We have a global corporate giant here, and we welcome Jocelyn Cascio, who is the Director for Human Rights at Intel. Intel at the heart, if not the founder, Jocelyn, if I got this right, of the digital revolution, the parent of Silicon Valley, the home of Moore's Law, which from memory, no notes, Moore's Law is that the number of transistors in a dense integrated circuit doubles every 2 years. The prediction was made 50 years ago and is still true today. And the purpose of Intel is very clear. They want to create a world-changing technology that touches and improves the lives of every person on the planet. And it's Jocelyn's job to make sure that that line is consistent in all the good things that Intel does in the world. Last but not least, we have Marc-Ivar Magnus, and he is the Vice President for Trade and Corporate Responsibility and Legal Affairs at the World Sports Good Federation. They are the masters of the sports product supply chain. That's my quote, not his. They bring together the manufacturers, the brands, the retailers, and associations. They represent 70% of global turnover, amounting to something like $498 billion. That's not inflation adjusted since the last time this number was published, in 195 countries. Big responsibility on Mark's shoulders to make sure that all the things that these members do are consistent with human rights standards. So there we have it. That's the introduction to the panel. What we have in front of us is a theme, mega sporting events and workers' rights, with a particular look at the supply chain issues which emerge. The speakers were given the time to present themselves and their issues and their thoughts. 10 minutes each is the limit, and then at the end of that we'll have questions. But we thought, given the complexity of the subject and the importance of the subject, you can't deal with this in a couple of soundbite references. So we're starting with Max at the ILO on the front lines in Qatar, followed by Jocelyn and by Mark. Thank you everybody for your attention, and we look forward to receiving your comments in the course of the presentations. Thank you everybody. Over to Max.
Thank you, Philip, and thank you to the Center for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. So to begin with, what I'd like to do is to present a little bit about the role of the ILO in Qatar and how our work relates to the World Cup. The ILO entered into a technical cooperation program with the government of Qatar in 2017 with the objective of implementing a comprehensive labor reform agenda. This program of work was agreed upon by the government of Qatar, the ILO, as well as international trade unions and employers' organizations. Shortly afterwards, in 2018, the ILO opened its first office here in Doha. And since then, we've been working hand in hand with the government, as well as social partners and other partners here on the ground, to develop key legislation and policies with regards to dismantling of the kafala system, introducing a non-discriminatory minimum wage, promoting dialogue between workers and employers, strengthening occupational safety and health, laws, policies, and systems, and enhancing the protection of domestic workers, and more. It's an extremely comprehensive and ambitious program of work. But it's important to note that this is not just about the World Cup, though the international scrutiny that comes with hosting the World Cup has certainly accelerated the change. These reforms here align with the National Development Strategy, with Qatar's national vision for 2030, especially when it comes to the creation of a competitive, knowledge-based, and diversified economy. These labor reforms are very much aligned with that national vision. Also, our program is working not just on the World Cup sites, but really for workers across the country, for all 2 million workers in the country. We're working on laws and policies and systems and institutions that affect all workers, including domestic workers. But at the same time, we're working very closely with the Supreme Committee for the Delivery and Legacy of the World Cup. We have partnered with them on a number of initiatives, including in relation to mitigating the effects of heat stress comprehensive research was conducted on a number of sites, including World Cup sites that led and informed new legislation on mitigating heat stress. We've also worked with the Supreme Committee on joint committees, platforms through which workers are elected and have a voice to engage with management representatives, learning from some of the models that they adopted earlier on and adapting them to different sectors of work, and now moving with them from the construction sites to the hospitality sector. And also we're very keen to support the Supreme Committee to take many of those good practices that they've developed over the past years and ensure that those can be transferred to other major contractors and clients in the country after the World Cup. So one of the questions we often receive is, has enough been done in terms of the labor reforms here in Qatar? And I think there is really a broad recognition that still work needs to be done on the labor reform agenda here. That's recognition from the ILO side, from the government of Qatar, from trade unions and civil society and elsewhere. We don't see the World Cup as the finish line. We've recently agreed with the government to extend the cooperation, the ILO's presence here, until at least the end of 2023, so a year beyond the World Cup. While the first phase of the program that recently ended really focused on how we can build up the legal and policy framework, we're now focusing on how we can effectively implement and enforce these laws. And naturally, any major reform anywhere in the world is faced with implementation challenges at first, and certainly some degree of resistance to change. And that's no different here in Qatar. There are three areas in which I'd like to highlight that where we're really prioritizing action, especially in the short term. Firstly, the non-payment of wages and benefits remains the number one concern of workers. We've seen a very good system called the wage protection system that has improved the detection of wage violations, wage-related violations. We've also seen that the penalties for non-payment of wages have been increased. But we're also pushing and working with the government to see how these penalties can be enacted more swiftly and how workers can be paid their outstanding wages more quickly. We've seen the introduction of an online complaints platform. We are now working with the government on how we can introduce additional measures to streamline access to justice. So the establishment of labor courts are a good practice, but still there is a backlog of cases with these labor courts. So the time it takes for them for workers to get hearings remains too long. So increasing the number of labor courts, for example, is something that is being considered in the near future. So that's the first issue with regards to wages and access to justice. Secondly, is the issue of the full implementation of the kafala reforms. Now, to date, 1 year after those major labor reforms were introduced around kafala, we've seen over 200,000 workers change jobs. That's about 10% of the workforce, which is a significant number. So labor mobility is happening. But at the same time, we do see many instances where unscrupulous employers are retaliating against workers who look to change jobs. We're seeing those unscrupulous employers cancel their residency permits. We're seeing them file absconding charges against them. We're seeing them introduce unwarranted non-compete clauses into contracts for workers where it really shouldn't apply. And you're really using other means through which to try and retain control of their workers. Again, this is something that we're well aware of and working with the government to address. For example, in the development of new legislation on non-compete clauses that really stipulate very clearly what are the criteria for introducing those into employment contracts. And the third priority, at least in the short term, relates to domestic workers. These reforms that I mentioned earlier around kafala, around the minimum wage, apply to domestic workers also. In addition, there is a separate piece of legislation on domestic work, which was adopted in 2017. And earlier this year, a new standard contract for domestic workers was introduced. That said, many of the rights that are outlined in those pieces of legislation are not fully applied, especially when it comes to working hours and the right to a day off. So this is an area where we're looking to see further progress.
Mm.
Now, despite these challenges and other challenges, it's important to acknowledge and really frame this in relation to the progress that has been made in just 3.5 years since the opening of the office here. And also acknowledge that a number of regional benchmarks have been established, certainly in terms of law and practice, in a number of areas, whether that's minimum wage setting, or the heat stress legislation, or the election of worker representatives at the enterprise level. Mm. Finally, what I'd like to share is a few thoughts about how I feel that stakeholders involved in the organization, delivery of the World Cup, the actors in the sporting ecosystem that are engaged in the Sporting Chance Forum, what role can they play to ensure that there's a positive legacy for workers in Qatar? I think really there is a need for stakeholders, particularly those outside of the country, to learn more about the labor reform agenda, to really find out the context, how much progress has been made, where more still needs to be done. I think too often, especially if we rely on media or social media, we won't get the full picture. There will often be articles that either completely disregard the developments or limited in terms of presenting the nuance. And then there are other articles that paint the picture as perhaps being too rosy. So we really encourage all stakeholders who are interested in the subject to really take a deep dive into this, and if possible, come to Qatar and meet with the various actors involved in the ground. I believe the government is fully open to engaging and also to facilitating these discussions. And secondly, as many of you, whether it's as sponsors or football associations or footballers themselves, many of you will have leverage in the space. And we encourage you also to take an active role in advancing the labor reforms, whether that's through discussions that you're having, whether that's through the commercial contracts you're signing in Doha with suppliers, really by informing yourself and acting on that to make sure that with your operations in Qatar, so with the contracts you're signing, that you do take due diligence and that decent working conditions are integrated into those arrangements. Okay. So thanks, Philip. I think I've reached the limit of my time.
Yeah. Fascinating, fascinating, Max. I think if you'd asked me, say 5 years ago, when that we would be in a position where you are today to announce basically the ending of the kafala system and labor reforms, we would have had great difficulty in accepting that would become a reality. So I think it's I know the labor movement, the Building Workers International, and the ITUC, the ILO. Have been fully engaged locally in intense discussions, sometimes tense discussions, but you've changed the reality on the ground. You made a number of requests, which I call a call to action. I think the center can play a role to get the message out to any potential mega sporting event organizer that reform can happen and must happen. That there is, take the opportunity of engaging with people and you will get a good outcome. And I think also it's very important, the leverage question that you mentioned, which comes up so often, in particular with respect to the UN guiding principles, that anyone that has this connection with Qatar should use their leverage to support what has happened and to develop what has happened as well. Just one quick question. What will happen to workers' voice? You talked about this possibility now for workers to sort of organize themselves. I'm not sure if it's works councils or what. What is the space that you have created?
Certainly, it's similar to the works councils that you see in Europe and elsewhere, where at the enterprise level, there are joint committees that have been established following the labor law. This includes representatives, elected worker representatives, meeting with management representatives on a monthly basis. Okay. These are really taking hold in a number of sectors already, and we're seeing increased appetite for that. I think one of the activities that we've recently completed is a review of the initial phase of the establishment of these joint committees. There's kind of universal feeling from the government, from employers, from the workers that these are mutually beneficial. And that from the employer side in particular, this is one way in which they can ensure that in light of the labor reforms and the increased labor mobility, that they're able to both attract and retain their best workers by listening to them, by engaging workers. Yeah. So there are these platforms for dialogue, but these platforms are also being used to train workers and worker representatives, as well as management representatives on different themes, whether it's consultation and negotiation, or issues related to grievance handling or violence and harassment at work, non-discrimination. All of these modules are being integrated into this program to make sure that these reforms are not just existing at the national level, but really flowing down into workplaces around the country.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating, just to finish, how this evolves. That when you give workers a say at their workplace on these issues which you've mentioned, how does that then transform itself into some kind of permanent organization where freedom of association is respected and so forth? But the aim is that when you include people, you get good outcomes. And I think there's a very powerful message coming from Qatar and the good work that the ILO has done to promote decent work and dialogue. I know from my experience with the Bangladesh Accord, the engagement of the ILO in the chairperson's role was very helpful and influential in bringing us to a good resolution. So thank you, Max. We now turn to Jocelyn. Cascio is the director for human rights at Intel. I understand it's a new position. Congratulations on this position, Jocelyn. You have huge responsibilities on your shoulders in this large, complex organization, which I think has more than 100,000 staff, and Lord knows how many suppliers in your supply chain. How do you go about ensuring that the supply chain is in line with human rights? And above all, you're an Olympic sponsor now. So Max mentioned leverage. This gives you big leverage, I would have thought, over at the IOC. Thank you. Jocelyn, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Really happy to join the panel and share some thoughts today. I did spend about a dozen years helping to create and evolve our supply chain responsibility program. So I do have just a couple slides to talk through what Philip introduced as the focus. So how we have developed systems to address workers' rights in our supply chain, where we do go beyond compliance, and some of the lessons we've learned along the way. So by way of kind of grounding everyone, we actually don't have a fully outsourced supply chain like a lot of tech companies do. So we actually do manufacture in the US, Israel, Ireland, and China. And then we have our own assembly test factories in China, Malaysia, and Vietnam, and Costa Rica. So we have our own set of factories around the globe, and that's really where our work starts. It's holding ourselves to the same standards that we hold our suppliers, whether around human rights, environmental ethics, or other expectations. Our supply chain is, as you might imagine, large and very global. So several hundred, close to 600 supplier factories in about 90 countries around the globe. We're sourcing, goods and services, both direct that go ultimately into our products, as well as ones that are indirect. And we've established over the past 15 years now or so, a really integrated approach to setting expectations for suppliers, holding them accountable, and also helping them when they do sometimes not have the maturity level or the acumen to meet those expectations. And I'll talk for a moment about the Responsible Business Alliance. This was formerly called the Electronic Industry Citizenship Coalition. We were one of 7 or so founding members back in 2004. So that organization is quite mature. And it's really the foundation on which we have built a lot of our systems to address worker rights in our supply chain. That organization came about because we started to learn about some of the struggles that suppliers were having in being compliant to Intel's code of conduct. And the reason for some of those struggles was because they had other large customers that had their own versions of codes where they may have seen 80 or 90% overlap in what the expectations were, but the 10 or 20% that was different was causing a lot of inefficiency and a difficult time for suppliers to be able to address those requirements. So this organization was really founded as a way to drive standards, efficiency, and of course, ultimately increase the breadth of the electronic supply chain that could be reached through an industry association. And it's evolved a lot over the years. It was actually renamed several years back because now membership is about 200 companies and goes well beyond the electronics industry. So not only do we have really every tier of electronics represented, but we have large organizations like Walmart and Amazon and Ford and others in automotive that are major customers of the electronics supply chain that's represented here. So that's, again, the foundation on which we build a lot of what goes above and beyond compliance. So we helped to create and we leverage things like standardized risk assessments and audit protocols through the RBA. We have the ability to share data and results. We also now have the benefit of a really robust capacity building program that the RBA has put in place, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. But we do choose through our human rights impact assessment and saliency analysis several key areas where we go above and beyond compliance and even really invest beyond what the Responsible Business Alliance Code deems as standard and kind of the minimum for member companies. And those are represented here. So responsible mineral sourcing, this really was grounded in the conflict minerals efforts that started back over a decade ago. So we've now grown well beyond tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold being sourced from DRC, where we helped to do a lot of the initial work and build the protocols there that are now leveraged across industries. And we've expanded that to the point where by 2030, through our RISE strategy and goals, we will have the same amount of confidence across any mineral in any Intel product that we do today around conflict minerals. So again, geographically going now into any conflict or high risk area and across all the minerals that we use in our products. Supplier diversity, very consistent with our overall longstanding diversity and inclusion efforts. Here we've spent over 1.2 billion just last year alone with diverse owned suppliers around the globe, and we're going to get to 2 billion in spending by the time we reach 2030. So another area where I think there's lessons to be learned and certainly benefits that we've seen in expanding that program. Environmentally, we have a strong effort around sustainable chemistry and helping leverage standards and tools like CDP to encourage our suppliers to be more transparent and to expand upon the work they do in this space. And then maybe most relevant to today's conversation, forced and bonded labor in our supply chain is indeed our most salient human rights risk. And this is another place where we've gone above and beyond compliance and really tried to not only address and remedy issues within our own supply chain. We've seen $23 million returned by our suppliers to workers over the past 7 years as a result of work we've done to help identify and educate and again, remediate these issues, especially for foreign migrant workers in places like Malaysia and Taiwan and Singapore, which are some of the highest risk areas in our own supply chain. But we've also helped to create as an extension of the RBA, the Responsible Labor Initiative, which is a cross-sector, multi-stakeholder approach to systematically addressing this issue, sharing best practices, and again, leveraging resources and expertise to have the greatest reach, ultimately with the goal that a rising tide lifts all boats. And so really doing a lot to collaborate oftentimes with competitors, with customers, to do things like shared capacity building, which if we could flip to the next slide, I'll talk a bit about. One of the key lessons we learned very early on in our engagement and proliferation of RBA standards was without a strong capacity building program to complement the auditing and the risk assessment, which are clearly important foundational elements of any supply chain responsibility program, we very quickly realized the resources we invested in that assessment and auditing space weren't ever really going to be enough to ultimately overall increase the maturity level of that global supply chain. So we see a pretty wide breadth of maturity across suppliers around the globe. Some are certainly leaders in their own right and addressing human rights issues without Intel having to ask or set expectations. But we certainly have less mature suppliers that do need a lot of support, and capacity building efforts over the years have really helped to provide oftentimes the acumen and to bring suppliers up that maturity curve. So we implemented our program back around 2011, 2012, and this was before the RBA had a robust capacity building program of their own. That is certainly something we leverage today and is a key component to how we help our suppliers along and help them address human rights and other challenges. But we ultimately have this spectrum, if you will, of options, a toolbox that we can reach into and deploy different solutions for different segments of our supply chain. Again, when suppliers are new and coming into maybe an RBA customer's supply chain for the first time, they need help. They are going to need some more hands-on, perhaps in-person training. We certainly leverage external sources for this, but sometimes we'll do things a little more innovative, like bring supplier HR and environmental managers to one of Intel's own factories so that they can engage with our staff there and literally see in the factory, what does it look like to have strong environmental management? What does worker management engagement look like in our factories? And so we try to have a breadth of different options around capacity building that we can deploy in ways that are going to be most impactful and effective and efficient for our suppliers. So this has been just such a critical part of the work we've done and have really helped us to go beyond compliance. And I think certainly one of the things that's been valuable to have expanded through RBA, and then again, continuing to add to the tools in our own toolbox to support suppliers where they may just need a little more help to be able to address human rights challenges in their factories and multiple tiers down through their own supply chains.
Thank you. There was a session yesterday concerning leadership and culture. What you're saying is that you have the commitment, not just from the CEO, but from the board and those in positions of authority at Intel to see this project through. Am I correct in understanding that this is a commitment from the top and it's not just a rubber stamp? This is active and it's engaged.
Yeah, absolutely. Board level oversight, executive staff engagement. We have a human rights steering committee that supply chain and many other groups play a very active role in. So yes, I would agree with that. And transparency is another piece of this. I didn't go into that very much here, but I do think transparency and disclosing not only goals and those strong achievements, but challenges and where we might still be faced with goals that we haven't been able to achieve. I think all of that's really critical, and a lot of that is in our CSR report, modern slavery statement, and otherwise.
Yeah, very good. We'll come on in the question and answer session at the end about your role as a sponsor. I know you are now in the top, one of the top sponsors of the IOC and the Summer and Winter Games. So it'd be interesting to see how you leverage your position, to quote Max, to get this message across. So thank you, Jocelyn, for that explanation. Just to tip you off, I just want to give a quote to you from John Ruggie. Maybe we'll come back to this. John Ruggie, the late John Ruggie, the father of the UN guiding principles, and particularly due diligence, he said, knowing and showing is necessary for companies to demonstrate they respect human rights. If they don't know and can't show, their claim is just that, a claim, not a fact. It appears to me, Jocelyn, that you're after the facts. Thank you. We'll come back to that. And this leads on nicely to the final presentation of today from Marc-Ivar Magnus, He is the Vice President for Trade, Corporate Responsibility and Legal at the World Federation for Sporting Goods. I think Swiss-based. I think one time they were up the mountains, not very far from Geneva. They're now in the big city in Bern. A large organization present in 195 countries, $498 billion worth of turnover. And then the question is, your job is to ensure that all those members are doing the right thing on human rights in their supply chain. So Marc, how do you do it?
Thank you, Philip. And also thank you to the entire team of the Center for giving us the opportunity to speak here. So as Philip already said, we're going to try in 10 minutes to look at some of the activities we have in the field of corporate responsibility at the WFSGI. I need to apologize for the abbreviation WFSGI. I will quickly explain who we are because we're not that known as the ILO or Intel. So we are the world governing body for the sporting goods industry. So we represent the sporting goods industry on a global level, if there are international issues at stake. We have, like Philip quickly said in the introduction, 3 kinds of members. We have the brands, you all know them, the Nike, Adidas, Asics, Puma, Under Armour, etc. We have retail, that's where the products are sold, so Sport 2000, Intersport, Decathlon. But we also have a few of the manufacturers where the products are produced mainly in Asia. And we are functioning in a way that we have working committees where the members can send delegates to, and those committees are covering different field of activities. And what we will go through today is mainly coming out of our corporate responsibility committee. So at the WFSGI, everything which is happening when it comes to worker rights, etc., is based on our code of conduct. So any activities in the field of sustainability is based on our code. The code is signed up to by each member who is joining our organization. It's reflecting all relevant international standards, ILO conventions, UN Declaration of Human Rights, etc. We're completely transparent. It's publicly available on our website. And it's also a code that is taken care of by our CR committee, where we have the experts from the company. So if anything is developing further, we are assessing whether we have to update that code to make sure we're still state of the art. And then the General Assembly has to vote on that. And we've also understood throughout the past years that it's nice to have a code with a few provisions out there, but for some companies it's challenging to understand that. What are working hours? What's a minimum wage? What's a fair wage, etc. So we have developed there what we call the supporting standard and guidelines document, which is basically taking each of the provisions and explaining a little bit more on a practical level. What does it mean actually, talking about child labor, etc. What kind of organizations are out there who are relevant for that topic, etc. So we try to get up to the practical level and provide a little bit more to our members. And of course, what's always important to keep in mind, we have a wide diversity of members. We have the big players who don't need that, but we have quite also a few players who do not have the resources in-house or the expertise in-house, and they need such support. So everything we do is based on our code. And then, as I said, we have that working group who is taking care of this topic. And the CR committee is basically in charge of developing and promoting an understanding in our industry of the relevance of all the social and environmental topics, like climate change, resource depletion, labor and health issues, etc. And it's a platform for all those companies, a neutral platform where they can meet with competitors and discuss certain issues, because we recognize that if you share suppliers, you have a shared responsibilities, and often it's not a successful approach if you want to solve those things alone, if you have other competitors sourcing from that supplier as well. We also want to create a first access point to provide expertise and knowledge to other members who have not been aware about certain issues. It's also a way to provide recommendations to the industry, and especially to position the industry when it comes to certain issues. And with that said, I come to the next point, which are our position papers in the field of corporate responsibility. It was the first time ever that the WFSGI has created position papers, and this was in the field of corporate responsibility. We have recognized the need to have those position papers, but we were kind of reluctant to have those classical position papers, because they're of no value to our members. So we worked with external experts, independent companies, and we said, these are the 11 topics that are relevant for us right now, and we want you to develop critical papers on those. And what they did, they interviewed some members, but what we always try to have is a best practice example on the subject. So one of the companies that did well, so that we can show that best practice example to members and give them some help how they can improve. We wanted to have those files to be shared with our members, and that they could also see not only that's the position, but how they could get there, what organizations are relevant, with whom can they cooperate, etc. We organized webinars for all of those topics with external experts, with those best practice example providers, etc., to show how this can be taken further by individual companies. We shared those papers with all kinds of organizations, the ILO, etc. We were asking them to critically review them as well. And that was an exercise that we did. The papers are all available on our website, so I'm not going to waste the time to explain you what topics we covered, but it's UN guiding principles, non-financial disclosure, factory closure and downsizing, chemical management, etc. So a wide range of topics that are relevant. Then the next topic that I would like to quickly talk about, which is an example to show how companies can become active, is our Responsible Sport initiative, which is an initiative that was developed by the bicycle industry, who joined the WFSGI in 2010. And there was a certain recognition that they were not on the same level like an Adidas, Nike, etc., when it comes to supply chain verification. And instead of reinventing the wheel and duplicating mistakes that were made in the past, they were looking for a neutral platform to develop a solution where they can work together. And they decided to do that under the WFSGI umbrella. And basically what they did is what we call today a quite unique solution that they developed. They started from scratch. They had that one time opportunity to develop something new. And what they did, they said, we make an annual overlap assessment through the WFSGI, and all the factories that we share, we're going to make one single audit in that factory by an independent third-party auditor, and we're going to share those costs equally. So we're going to focus on remediation and corrective actions. We're going to share that work. We're going to share the costs, but we're not going to audit those manufacturers on a daily basis. We have manufacturing members at the WFSGI. They get audited 360 times a year. So it means they have several audits going on at the same time. And then there's a risk that you're stuck in that tick box exercise and you're not looking actually into improving things. And so the RSI is really focusing on working together on sharing costs, and we call it an entry-level auditing solution. And we filled in a gap because all those really sophisticated solutions out there, they do not provide something for smaller companies. And we leave those companies aside. Not only smaller companies, but also bigger companies who have not yet become active in verifying their supply chain. So it's not about resources, it's also about the expertise that you have in-house. And so with that solution, you can reach through to companies who might have a supply chain manager or an in-house lawyer who can do a few audits next to his classical work. And we provide that opportunity to companies who wouldn't be able to buy into those sophisticated solutions today, but to have an entry-level solution. And this is open to any kind of companies today. It's independent from the WFSGI membership. And this is one of the examples where we try to fill in a gap. And then looking at the time, I will move fastly forward to one of the last important points that I think, so especially for the audience today, it's one of the examples how workers' rights can be taken seriously in effective manner, and it's the WFSGI pledge for the FIFA quality concept. This is a cooperation which has been lasting for, I guess, over 20 years now with FIFA, where it all started that FIFA said we have to verify somehow how footballs are manufactured in factories. It was all in the 90s about child labor, and it started there with the Atlanta Agreement. And today we have a quite sophisticated solution together with FIFA, where any kind of FIFA licensee, whether they produce football, turf, EPTS, electronic player tracking systems, goal line technology, before they become a FIFA licensee, they have to prove that they're in line, in compliance with our code of conduct. And that's not just a simple signature or something that is put on their paper. They actually have to provide an audit report from an independent third-party auditor on an annual basis that is verified by our staff, and where remediation actions have to be taken if they're not in compliance. And even if the licensee is lasting, the license agreement is lasting 4 years, this is renewed on an annual basis. And this is a really nice example, I think, so where FIFA is a front runner, and where they take their responsibility towards the workers and for the companies who are producing products under their license, and where they're working together with the industry. So, Philip, I guess I reached the time limit and give it back to you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Well, I must say I'm a veteran of the Bangladesh Accord, and I was in office in April 2013 when the disaster happened, and we were very strong on going for a legally binding agreement, and we ended up with a legally binding agreement which has been renewed, which covered the health and safety dimensions to the garment production in Bangladesh. Since then, there's been a strong push for mandatory due diligence and mandatory due diligence measures for business when it comes to the UN guiding principles. Where do you stand in your federation with respect to mandatory? Isn't this going to make life more straightforward for you? There will be a global standard. There will be global rules of the game. Instead of having this multitude of 360 audits taking place at different times of the year, isn't it time for a mandatory due diligence approach?
Is your question turning towards if we can make it mandatory as a federation, or is that the question for our members?
My hope is that we will have mandatory due diligence, but that's giving the game away there, Mark. Where do you stand on mandatory due diligence measures as a federation? Is it something that you welcome to level up, or is it something you have doubts about?
Yeah, so the situation has to be seen for us as a federation on a global level. We cover not only different countries, different legislation, but also different kind of companies, global companies, local companies, etc. So it's difficult to put them all into one basket. So we try to support and promote as good as possible to bring up to speed all those different kind of companies. As I explained with our code, we don't want to have just a code. We want to have additional support on webinars, etc., to explain them how they can meet those things. And I think so it's important that we are not phasing them out, like I said with the RSI, that we're not forgetting there's a multitude of smaller companies. And if you say, for example, well, this is the auditing solution, and they can't just do that because of a resource or an expertise point of view, then you leave them out and they're doing nothing. So we are rather there to say we want to provide any kind of solution to bring up to speed also those companies who are not there yet. That we see as our task in the CR committee and with our CR work to not just focus on the Nikes and the Adidas, but also to see all those other smaller companies and say, as an industry, we want to leverage what we're doing. And if we make anything in our membership mandatory, we will lose them and they will not maybe do anything. And we prefer having them there, providing step-by-step support. And what we always try to say is companies and also federations out there have to understand this whole sustainability discussion. That's a journey, you know. If you think I'm not getting active because I'm not perfect and you're just standing there not doing anything, you're actually not only not moving ahead, you're just going backwards, because sustainability is evolving so quickly that if you stand still, you're going backwards because everybody else is moving ahead. And you just have to become active and start that journey, even if you do it with small things, even if you start somewhere, and that we see as the importance. There.
I think that that point you mentioned is that these pressures are permanent. The desire for change is building, and it goes, I would say, it goes beyond the civil society and the trade union movement into the citizenry at large. They're concerned about the conditions under which goods are made, and they want to be sure that the that there's an integrity and ethical regime behind it, but they have no doubts that the people at the end of the supply chain are treated fairly. Unfortunately, both you and I know that the reality on the ground is not always as is reported. And that's why in the Bangladesh Accord, we went for a legally binding agreement. But thank you for your frankness, and thank you for the efforts that have been made by the Sports Goods Federation to raise standards in this regard. Now, we got a couple of questions that have come in. Perhaps, Jocelyn, when I talked about this know and show point from John Ruggie, maybe it might well keep you awake at night that you don't know as much as you would like to know, and how you deal with this gap. And then I have, whilst Jocelyn is answering, I'll let you have the question so you can reflect, is how can corporate partners to major events support good labor practices in host locations of major events? I think that's pretty clear. And what should the expectations be of sports federations when they award events to countries? Should we be going to places that need to improve and use those events as a force for good? So, Jocelyn, to start with you on the Ruggie quote.
Sure. I think a risk-based approach is not only consistent with the UN guiding principles, but really necessary for any organization that has a large supply chain, right? So no company, no matter how large or how many resources, is going to, all at once be able to know exactly what's going on in every corner with tens of thousands of suppliers around the globe. So we have established a risk-based approach that's leveraging, again, a good number of external, standards in terms of helping to determine where to focus our efforts first and most. And that certainly considers, obviously, leverage, as we've talked about a little bit, but understanding what we do about the saliency of the risks in the supply chain and where we can affect the greatest amount of change. So we are very transparent about both what we do and don't know. So we do disclose quite a bit of detail. For example, not only numbers of audits that we do, but how many findings we have specific to forced and bonded labor, how many of those remain open. Again, things like the fees and other conditions, passports being held, any conditions of forced and bonded labor. We try to be very transparent about what those challenges are and share, again, some of the capacity building that we're doing to help suppliers make progress. We also talk about when we have to hold a supplier accountable in terms of publicly sharing where there are serious ongoing challenges. So we have done that in the past, and we've certainly had to exit business with suppliers as well, where there has not been, enough progress or sufficient change in addressing issues. So completely agree with the knowing and showing, and we really try to include both the good news and the bad news when we disclose publicly the work that we're doing.
What I think is striking from what you've mentioned is the rigor with which you approach this job, and the fact that you, as the Human Rights Director, have the resources and a team and the support of the leadership to get on with the job. Perhaps one of my takeaways from this is that the IOC, FIFA, UEFA, any sporting federation must have a human rights director with a team, with a seat on the board, and with the resources to do the kinds of things that you're doing to ensure there's consistency on the human rights front. Now let's move to one. So thank you, Jocelyn. In the meantime, I'll just repeat the question. What should the expectations be of sport federations when they award events to countries? Should we be going to places that need to improve and use those events as a force for good? I would put a slight twist on it. What's the leverage that you have to ensure that those sports federations are doing the right thing? Who would like to kick off on that with that? Max?
Thanks, Philip. I think what I feel like in this development of the reform agenda here in Qatar and the technical cooperation program has really brought a wide range of both traditional and non-traditional partners together. And I think that this really lays the foundation for much longer standing engagement, not just in Qatar, but also for the next host of mega sporting events. I think this is going to be part of the legacy of the World Cup in Qatar as well. That, engaged and brought together so many different partners and really shown that labor reforms can be an integral part of the process. Everybody's got a role to play. I think certainly I don't want to dismiss and or put aside the fact that there's still work to be done. I think I outlined that in my previous remarks. We're not there yet, and certainly there is a commitment to do that, and it will go beyond the World Cup. If I may, Philip, also just jump on the previous question with regards to the knowing and showing. I was thinking about it in relation to our work with the government of Qatar. One of the things that we are constantly encouraging is to know better what's going on in the country. This is, through the improvement of collection of data, but also engaging more closely with workers. And I'm happy to say that the government has been responsive. In our office here, we host 4 community liaison officers from the global unions, whose job it is to hear from workers and to collect the feedback on how the reforms are going. But there are other channels as well, including regular forums with community leaders. There are other feedback mechanisms. Also, when it comes to data and sharing the publication of this data, this is also something where we've seen some progress indeed, whether that's in the form of our annual reports. For the last 3 years, we've issued annual reports to the ILO governing body, but also there are standalone reports on the, assessing the labor inspection system, assessing the wage protection system, identifying the problems and the gaps, but putting forward recommendations as a roadmap for how these can be improved in the future. And also, let's not forget the regular reporting to the ILO Committee of Experts on the application of conventions and recommendations. This is another way in which the government is submitting and sharing data in a public forum.
I think the essence is nothing to fear. Engage with the stakeholders. If labor laws need to reform them, and get involved in a dialogue and have a rigorous process behind it to send a new message to the world. I think there's a new message to the world coming from Qatar. You've been very frank in saying the job's not done. There's concerns about legacy, but even so, I think there's this is milestone. And anyone looking to organize a mega sporting event should pay due care and attention to what's happened there. Mark, did you want to come in on this question?
Yeah, I guess I can refer to what I said before. It's a journey. And Philip, you mentioned FIFA, UEFA, and IOC, but there are many other international sport federations out there. And all of them should also become active, get on the journey. We've been in contact with a few to explain what we do with FIFA, so we invite them to get active. And then I want to make a small differentiation. I talked about the pledge we do for FIFA, and this has nothing to do with the World Cup. This is on an ongoing basis. If you buy a football and there's a FIFA quality logo on it, then this work is done. And there we are in a different situation in the sporting goods industry than, for example, Jocelyn with Intel, because we are not just sponsoring an event or a World Cup. We are sponsoring the athletes 365 days a year, whether there's an event or not. And what's important for us as well is that this is recognized, but also that the federations, if they work together with a host city, and there's a certain standard for that game, for that championship, that standard is kept. We've seen that there were other games and the standard was lower again. So the International Federation should be aware that they're the owner of that logo and they're responsible for what's happening if an event takes place with that logo, no matter where the host city is. So that there is a certain standard, and then we stick to that standard and we don't leave it up to the host city to decide on those standards. That's important, that we think that we move ahead successfully, is that we stick to those standards. And transparency is key, that all the players can see what the requirements are. That's the message from our side.
High standards consistently applied, in a nutshell. How, Jocelyn, you're a major sponsor. This is relatively new in the Intel experience. How do you flex your muscles over at the IOC?
I think I've heard a lot of good thoughts from Max and Mark that I would just build upon and say, in addition to transparency, to pick up on that most recent comment, just the notion of really helping to encourage multi-stakeholder collaboration, which of course the center is here to help with, and we value that very much. And I think also I would place that emphasis on any mega sporting event having really robust, intentional, efficient supplier capacity building as a way to really help to ensure that workers' rights and human rights stay at the focus throughout every stage of the process, from the earliest all the way through any event that's held. So really appreciate the work the center does in that respect.
Thank you. We have how many minutes left? So I'm just getting my director of broadcasting here is telling me how much time we have left. We're basically out of time. So I give you each that. Jocelyn, that was your message to the center. Duly noted. Multi-stakeholder engagement. Max, what's your message to the center? They have a working group. I'll mention this in my closing remarks. They have a working group on mega sporting events. And I'll ask the same question to Mark. What's your message to the center in terms of homework for the center to do?
And from our side, we greatly appreciate the center's commitment to working closely with the trade unions and employers, and also with the ILO. We recognize the great convening power that the center has in bringing us together with also the non-traditional partners. And I hope that we will continue to learn and benefit from those exchanges that the center has created for us to participate in.
Yeah.
And looking forward, I hope that, as I said, right now the focus is on Qatar, but in the future, I hope that the center will be able to share the good experiences from Qatar with the future hosts of mega sporting events.
Yeah, very good. I think, I think so. That would be a very powerful message to any potential organizers of future mega sporting events. Mark, what's your message to the center?
Well, I think so. The center did a huge amount of work to develop that far in such a short period of time, convening all those important players. And I think that's the asset of the center, and it should go on into the same direction by being as inclusive as possible, including many kind of players, looking at a broad range of federations to bring them up to speed. And as Max just said, by sharing the experiences that they made with Qatar, but also that certain federations did with smaller federations, this could be a game changer as well. So be as inclusive and transparent as possible.
Okay, message, multi-stakeholder engagement, frank conversations, lifting the bar, making sure this journey continues, and be free of fear, because the expectations of the world out there is changing and the demands are increasing. But we have 3 examples here of how this problem is being tackled from the Jocelyn's presentation, from your own, Mark, and indeed from Max. What can I say? I'd like to thank each of you for your presentations. I listened very carefully to all the contributions that you made and looked deeper in my own preparation for this. And I want to carry this message into the work of the board of directors at the Center for Sports and Human Rights. When it comes to stakeholder engagement, I'm a former Global Union General Secretary, and we spend our lives looking for dialogue and looking for that engagement. And the global unions are always ready to step in and have this conversation. The work that in Qatar is just one example. What we did in Bangladesh was another. What's important, I think, is also to say that sport is no exception in this general push about the redefinition of purpose for business. And also the redefinition of sport is becoming a force for the sport for good, that these rules apply, that the supply chain rules apply, that the human rights laws apply, and that the workers' rights laws apply, and that it's time to embrace them in a spirit of cooperation and a spirit of dialogue. We haven't talked much about the athletes today, but I've also felt that when those athletes are performing on the field of play, they also want to be able to compete in the sense that the games that they are participating in and that they've prepared for are consistent with the most basic of human rights principles. The athletes are the labor and the product, and that they also have a voice that should be recognized, it should be heard, and that they should have the right to also have a voice in terms of the conditions under which they undertake sport and also to shape sport. So I think this idea that you've all expressed of engagement and recognition of these basic rights contributes to the force for good. I quite like the example of Paris 2024 and the social contract. And I'd like to see a proper social contract at the IOC and the other sports federations in the approach of sponsors who are financing the games, and indeed in the supply chain. And each of you have talked about what that social contract looks like. I referred to Moore's Law earlier and the doubling of application and capacity. I would love to see a doubling of the application of fair labor standards every 2 years for the next decade, and we will have a very different world of sport that we will have to deal with. I talked about Zeus and the lightning bolt. For me, the lightning bolt in this conversation has been the reference to the UN guiding principles and due diligence. Each of you expressed a sense of urgency. Each of you expressed a very positive message that this world of sport is changing and we're helping to move it into the right direction, which, as a new strategy for the Centre says, to make force people-centered and a force for good. Thank you for your attention, for all those who have listened in, and thank you for the time that each of you have taken to make your case and to explain how you are contributing to ensuring that sport is a force for good. Thanks, everybody.